Welcome back to another episode of the Apache podcast. Um, we have some pretty big updates. We just had the Ukrainians and the Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met in Berlin. So we're gonna break down some of the updates and findings from their meeting. But I got a few videos lined up for us to take a look. So.
It's been nearly 4 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and there's still no peace deal that both Kyiv and Moscow can accept. But in recent weeks, diplomacy has reached a frenzy, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky holding urgent talks with leaders from dozens of countries, some known as the Coalition of the Willing, as he pushes for peace on Kyiv's terms. This rush follows the emergence last month of a leaked U.S.-drafted peace plan that appeared to greatly favor Russia. And Zelensky has now sent a counter-peace proposal to Donald Trump. The talks have also grown more complex.
This peace agreement has been going back and forth for, you know, I mean, it's been a couple months to a few months now, because it originally was the 28-point peace plan, the Russians' Christmas wish list, and then, it was redrafted by the Ukrainians to like 19, 20 points. They proposed that in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, and then had several meetings again in Miami. And then here we have a draft or version of the discussion. So.
After Washington released a document last week outlining its foreign policy, which is strikingly harsh.
Oh yeah, this is something that's pretty interesting with their national security strategy. Essentially, from my understanding of this document, you know, created by the Trump administration, um, is we're not going to acknowledge the aggressor role of Russia in this war, and as well as potentially, I don't want to say that Europe is a threat, but Europe is self-destructing in a way, whether that is, the Europeans' immigration, which is interesting to me because why is Europeans' immigration a national security for the United States? Anyways, and also the United and also the Europeans' role in the Ukrainian war. So I don't know why that has anything to do with it. It blows my mind.
On Europe, while conspicuously light in its criticism of Moscow. To help make sense of it all, I'm joined by Carl Bildt. He's a former Prime Minister of Sweden and now co-chairs the European Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for taking the time. It is good to see you. So as we mentioned, Ukraine and its European allies have sent President Trump their own peace proposal, but serious gaps remain, specifically over territorial concessions and U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine. It is clear that President Trump at this point is quite impatient and reportedly wants a deal done by Christmas, but all of his pressure seems to be directed at one.
He already had one. It's I believe Daniel Driscoll or something, the Secretary of Army, sent by Trump, said that Zelensky need to accept this document by Thanksgiving, and that was scrapped. So.
Party, and that is Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah. When it comes to deadlines from Trump, it's pretty pointless. From what I've noticed. So.
Russia is continuing its maximalist demands here. So what is the?
But not the Iranians. I mean, the Iranians got hit hard. So.
That that tell you about the type of deal that President Trump may force Ukraine to accept?
Well, up until the rather infamous summit in Alaska, the Europeans and Trump was basically on the same line: a ceasefire, end the fighting along the existing lines, and then go on from there and try to resolve the different political issues. But since Alaska, President Trump has changed and essentially endorsed the Russian demand that Ukraine should give up territory which Putin has not been able to conquer in spite of throwing his entire armed might against it for 3.5 years. And that is something that is unacceptable for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are ready to accept a ceasefire along the existing lines. The Europeans, although we are saying,
Yeah, so essentially what he's saying is like Trump endorsed the, the talking points that Ukrainians need to give up the unconquered territory, which is, I mean, obviously that's a terrible idea. I'm going to reiterate is that the region that they haven't, so this white outline is the Donetsk region or the Donbass region. So you have this area as the Donetsk, and then the top side as the Luhansk. But you can see some of this is in red, and this essentially is a heavily fortified region that, the Ukrainians has been building up since 2014, since Crimea was taken. And you can see the darker shades of red. Those are kind of like the Russian separatist um, since 2014 as well. So yeah, this area has been fortified for over a decade.
this is for Ukraine to decide, but basically supporting that line. And I think that is in the counter proposal that President Zelensky has now sent to President Trump. And then let's see, is President Trump ready to put pressure on President Putin instead of just press the pressure on?
So far, there hasn't been really any. I don't think there's any pressure um, for the Russians at all. Which, I mean, obviously, this is a. I mean, Trump and Putin are pretty much best buddies. So, I mean, obviously, the Americans don't exactly see the Russians as an ally. But I mean, just in the past, I mean, it's funny to me because I I I lost count how many times Trump and his administration. I'm talking about J.D. Vance. I'm talking about Rubio, Hegseth. His goon squad. Um, pretty much forcing Ukrainians with certain you know um, things that they need to give up, and yet Russians hasn't they haven't, and of course you're going to have people saying, well, obviously the Russians aren't going to conquer, you know the Russians aren't taking all of Ukraine, so that's a plus. Like, okay, I mean, you're retarded if you think, if that's what you're going to say. Sure, it's silly to say that, because I mean the Ukrainians or the Russians hasn't barely taken any territorial gains in the last 18 to 24 months, and their casualties are through the roof. Yeah, they can, Putin is just going to throw bodies at the problem, but hey, he's got what, maybe 5 to 10 years left.
On President Zelensky.
Yeah, and President Zelensky maintains that he has no legal
And that doesn't mean that the next guy is going to be better.
or moral right to cede land to Russia. It has been reported that European leaders are warning President Zelensky not to cede territory unless they get firm guarantees from the United States about security provisions for Ukraine. If that doesn't happen, is Europe effectively?
Yeah. So what she's pretty much stating for the Europeans is like, you know, it comes down to the Budapest the memorandum. It's like, well, the U.S. pretty much said, we're going to give you protection if you give up your nukes. Obviously, that's, yeah. the rest is history. So the Ukrainians want to make sure that the Americans are actually, going to keep their words. NATO-like, a NATO Article 5-like agreement that's legally binding. That isn't just a document that looks pretty. So
telling President Zelensky or advising President Zelensky not to accept President Trump's plan? And if so, is that a wise move?
Well, it's essentially up to President Zelensky to decide. But
true,
essentially, the
true.
European sympathy
Well,
will be here.
not 100%. It is for him to decide, for him to think he decide, because at the end of the day, this, this isn't just him. It's also the Russians. And unfortunately, the Russians has the upper hand, and they usually dictate the terms, more so, much, much more so than the Ukrainians are going to try to dictate terms. Yeah, Zelensky's going to say, hey, you know, sure, no NATO, but we want, something similar to NATO, no territorial concessions, um, and whatever else. All of that can look great on paper, but if Putin's not going to accept it, great, back to the drawing board.
I mean, with him, it's not fair to ask him to give up lands that he has been shedding blood and tears and lives for 3.5 years just because Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump likes it.
Well, I mean, they're technically on the winning side, so you're not gonna the Russians are not gonna end this war without taking, you know, 80% of 80 or 100, 80 to 120% of what they currently occupy, meaning, their Ukrainians might get some land back, but Ukrainians might also give up some, land that potentially they control. So
Is the Europeans or are the Europeans ready to support Ukraine? Well, I mean, the Europeans are now doing most of the support of Ukraine anyhow, be that financial or be that military. America has backed away from quite a lot of it already, regrettably, but that's a fact.
So are you suggesting that if the United States does walk away or doesn't offer specific security guarantees for Ukraine, that Europe is ready to step in its place? And do you think, if so, that that's deterrent enough for Vladimir Putin not to at some point reinvade Ukraine?
you can't predict
Well, as a
that.
matter of fact, I don't think there are any sort of paper security guarantees that can replace what we need to do anyhow in the years ahead, and that is support Ukraine financially.
It doesn't matter. There's nothing the Europeans financially can't. Maybe not replace. Replace is not a proper word. But essentially they can't match the amount. When the United States is willing and does support, to some degree, the Europeans can't match that level of uh, monetary support and military support, because you have one country versus 30 plus Europeans, and some Europeans aren't exactly on board with a lot of these. I mean, even if you look at Europeans as several country entities. I mean, you have Italy, who's against the frozen Russian assets. You have Hungary, you have Slovakia, all these European countries who I mean, who wants to essentially are collective European unions, but they all still operate semi-autonomously when it comes to certain things like this.
That, call it reconstruction or call it sustaining the Ukrainian state or call it helping to finance their defense. I think the security guarantee that is really relevant for Ukraine in the future is their own defensive capabilities. I don't think it's going to be sort of American or European papers or even commitments of military support. It's going to need their own efforts, but those efforts are going to require our financial support, and that I'm quite convinced the Europeans will be ready to.
Well, this all comes as the U.S. released a national.
fun fact. I mean, obviously, that I don't know. I believe this to be true. I don't know how, how true it is, how well the military is in Europe. Um, as of now, I wholeheartedly believe Ukrainians is definitely one of the stronger military in all of Europe. I would put it, next to Germany, France, and UK alike military. One, because I mean the Ukrainians have refined, um, modern warfare to what it is today. Um, I mean, if you look at France and you look at Germany, those countries hasn't been, been fighting a war, um, um, as far, modernly speaking. But at the same time, if they're not fighting, any conflict that's close to them. They're if if they were to participating in any warlike activities, it'd be the Middle East or African continent. But obviously Ukraine doesn't have it is pretty much landlocked to its neighbor, and that's why with they're essentially learning on learning at the same time. So I I think that Ukrainians is top three, top two military of all of Europe. But yeah, I could be wrong, but that's just
uh,
my opinion.
our financial support, and that I'm quite convinced the Europeans will be ready to.
Well, this all comes as the U.S. released a
Oh, the reason why I say, let me provide some insight on my the reason is I mean you look at the amount of drones that the Europeans freak out when there's 20 drones that flies into certain regions and they're not going to take any action or can't. I don't know what that bureaucracy or their foreign policy is when you have 20 plus drones flies into Poland and nothing comes out of it. So, you have countries like Moldova, Romania alike, um, that pretty much just sucks to suck. It happens. And then, you have Ukrainians getting 500 plus drones every other day. Um, yeah. So it's almost you can't even compare, the realities. And um, you're also talking about like, because I'm thinking, um, because I mean UK is not part of EU anymore, so they might operate a little differently. But when I'm thinking like the Ukrainian military prowess, um, sure they have gotten a lot of help from Western countries, ATACMS, HIMARS, F-16s, and the alike. Sure, all of those are Western weapon, and I'm not saying that the Ukrainians pre all of these supplies are at the top, but I do know that the Ukrainians adapt very, very rigorously. I mean, they have to adapt and learn the equipment on the job, learn the equipment the hard way. So, you don't have a traditional military who you learn how these weapon system work, and then maybe you pick and choose what you want. Not that the Ukrainians just got to use whatever they can find, um, or combatant.
national security strategy unlike any that we've seen in decades, describing, quote, civilizational erasure in Europe, accusing European governments of abandoning and subverting democracy, and effectively declaring an end to NATO's role as an expanding alliance. And we should note your country.
So, uh, I'm probably gonna say this a lot because in my heart, I really do believe it. And it, these comments only support my view even more so, is that if a European country, especially a Eastern European country, is invaded, such as Baltics, Romania, Moldova, one of those countries are invaded by Russia, in, I don't know, from now until who knows, 2030, or until Trump is out of office again. I don't think the United States will come to its defense. Um, you know, the Europeans can say, hey, we enact Article 5, if one country is invaded, all countries come to its defense. Yeah, well, I don't know about that. Because I do understand, I know how these games are played. I also know how, because you look at the American policy in the American what the American want lately, especially with Trump in office. It's American first. Americans wants out of foreign wars. Well, if if Russia were to invade another European country, well, that's just another issue, another thing that the United States would have to tend to, on top of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Deterring China from Taiwan, deterring North Korea, deterring the Russians from Ukraine. I mean, I don't know if they're deterring right now, but um, essentially they have they're going to be spread out pretty thin, um, and maybe it does happen one day. Because I mean, I've heard several times that the United States wants to pull out of NATO. That can also be something that's in the near future, um, because NATO is the only reason why NATO as strong as is because it's because of the United States fronting most of the cost and the military support of NATO. I'm not saying that Europeans isn't paying their part. I mean, they are now slowly, because of Trump is forcing them. Um, but yeah,
Is the latest member to have joined that alliance. Moscow clearly has welcomed this language. And we know publicly European leaders have been quite muted in response to this report, but privately they seemed alarmed. What is your reaction?
Well, I thought the document, particularly in the section on Europe, because the sections of Europe are different from the other sections, it's a fairly bizarre document, I have to say. It has an extremely distorted view of what's happening in Europe. I mean, it expresses concern about the fate of democracy in Western Europe, but not the fate of democracy in Russia or China, or not to speak about Saudi Arabia and other places. It sees Russia as a factor for stability, which is fairly bizarre, when more than bizarre, I have to say, when Russia is a country that has been attacking another European country and is conducting hybrid warfare against other European countries. Not a single word about that, but only criticizing Europeans for.
the United States doesn't care in the slightest of what the Russians do with their foreign affairs, hybrid warfare or not. They could care less. But when it involves the United States, maybe they care a little bit more. But right now, sorry. Um, yeah, Russians hybrid affair on Europeans is not of any interest in the United States.
Something that, I mean, frankly, bizarre.
You're right. The strategy does call for, quote, strategic stability with Russia at this moment, which is a lot of European leaders now waiting for the national defense strategy, which is expected to be released soon as well. I want to ask you about the focus of the upcoming issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. It has a very provocative title, How Europe Lost. And here's the crux of their argument. By giving in to Trump on defense, trade, and democratic values, Europe has effectively bolstered those far-right forces that want to see a weaker EU. Europe's Trump's strategy, in other words, is a self-defeating trap. There's only one way out of the cycle. Europe must take steps to restore agency where it still can, rather than wait it out until January 2029 when magical thinking assumes the current transatlantic nightmare will come to an end. The EU needs to stop groveling and build greater sovereignty. Only then will it neuter the political forces that are hollowing it out.
The Europeans has been dependent on the United States for decades. You know, sure, I agree that the Europeans needs to stop leeching off of United States, and again going back to the only reason why uh countries around the world is afraid of NATO. It's not because of European countries. It's because of the United States have the Europeans back. However, in today's terms, I you know I can't confidently say that the United States will have Europeans back. I mean, you just look at the foreign strategy, the national strategy plan. Obviously, it's pretty much a document that just trashes on the Europeans. Um, and maybe this will will wake up the Europeans that they need to be not only self-reliant and self-sufficient, but also need to be less reliant on Russia, less reliant on Russia in terms of resources, energy and oil, and less reliant on the United States for militarily, and always pretending that the United States will have your back, because I mean, maybe we will help the Europeans, during an invasion, but the Europeans needs to stop thinking like that and don't bank on it, because one of these days it's not going to work out, and United States is going to say, hey, we told you this day is going to come. We told you to bolster your defenses and stop relying on United States. Sucks to suck. You're on your own. Even if it's part of NATO, the United States can easily you know, just back away.
From within. Do you agree with that assessment?
I disagree with the assessment, but I agree with the recommendations. I mean, Europe have to stand on its own legs somewhat more. That's what we're doing now in terms of defense. There's no question. We have to build a NATO with substantially less of the United States. We have to look at the sort of the competitiveness of our economy. So we need to do more and to be more self-confident. But as the nature of our society is, I don't think we need to be particularly shy. I looked at sort of one index, for example, freedom of the press. The United States is number 53 on that list. Every single European Union country is well ahead of the United States, with one exception, that's Hungary. That happens to be sort of an indirect ideological ally on President Trump. And if you take sort of social indicators, the number of people in prison, the level of overall education, the nature of the health system, and the life.
Okay, I mean, he does bring up some few, I guess, decent points. Every country has expresses. Sorry that I'm steering away from the Ukrainian, Russian, but off topic. Um, I mean, Americans are one of the dumbest country. Um, I mean, I'm sure everybody has watched, these street interviews. Tell me what country is this a country or a continent, or where is Africa a country or continent? And some pretty basic questions that could easily be answered. And obviously, the Americans are one of the dum-dums, and time after time struggles to answer some of these basic questions. And Europeans, tend to excel. Uh, I mean, obviously, they're tiny. They have many countries spread out. So maybe it's given that they know some of these geographical questions. But I mean, the guy pretty much said essentially every country has their, has a different. United States, doesn't rank the highest when it comes to certain freedom of press or whatever. I mean, obviously, Europe, freedom of speech doesn't exist in Europe, or UK. Sorry, I keep thinking UK is not a part of Europe anymore. So, but you get the gist of it. It's like, you could say something stupid on the internet and get arrested. Um, stupid things like that. So,
Quality. I think we offer a quality of life for the majority of our people that is better than we offer in any other part of the world. So we have to be perhaps somewhat more self-confident and self-assured when it comes to these issues. The quality of life in Europe is, I think, unsurpassed in the world today.
Carl Bildt, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
I think um, what's another important factor is like the United States would never see Russia as a threat for its, for the U.S. continental side. They have bodies of water, um, pretty much as a barrier. However, the Europeans don't have the luxury of that. And every time that the Europeans, have a discussion, it's always like, you know, what's the Russians gonna do, the next time they attack, or which country is the next in line, because they're landlocked. I mean, you got countries sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Moscow, mainland Russia. So yeah, I don't know how that, of course, Europeans are uh, a lot more scared, I should say, scared of Russia than United States. United States don't really care. I mean, obviously we've had conflict with Russia since World War II and Cold War, and the conflict in Syria and some other areas in the Middle East. But yeah, I think that's gonna be it for this episode. Um, yeah, I'll break down more during the next episode on some more, on what happened, between the peace talks. If there's any new updates, yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, all that YouTube stuff. Yeah, thanks.